And God always determines good by his standards, not ours. So he's not basing it on our standard of goodness, which is going to be much more or less than perfect, right? But God's standard of goodness is always based on himself. He uses himself as that standard. He says, "Be ye holy, for I am holy." He said, "Be you holy, for I am holy." And so he himself is that standard. He says that because I could swear by no greater, I swear by myself. There's none that's greater than God. The Bible says there's none that's greater than God, no, not one. And so nobody is greater than God, and nobody would be used as a standard of God. So God's standard of goodness is nothing less than perfection. Welcome back to Apologetics 101. I'm your resident Christian apologist, Brian Keith Bowen. Um, and I'm going to be doing part two of the debate review series that I got on. It's a side series to my Genesis series. My Genesis series is my main one. Um, I recently got the third thing I was waiting for, but it came in the form of an audio book here, and I didn't want the audio book, so I'm having to try to sit there and see if I can uh, return that to Amazon to get the actual paperback book of it, but we'll see. Any given case, I need to contact Amazon about that and check on that. But that's for a new video that I plan on coming up with soon, hopefully, in my Genesis series. Any given case, I decided to do part two of that. The last video was kind of long, but uh, it had quite a bit of people that viewed it, so it was, I wouldn't say it's the most popular channel because I've actually had a video that has over 600 views on it. But any given case, uh, it was decent for a new video to have that many viewers on it. I decided to do a second part to this, which I already intended to do. A second part to the this debate review that I've been doing, and again, but this time I'm gonna try to. I'm not gonna try to go too long on it. It's gonna be part two. I'm gonna try to cover as much ground as possible, but I'm gonna try not to cover too much. So hopefully that would work out better. But just to kind of give you some overview, we're dealing with this debate review, or this particular debate between uh, a guy by the name of Aaron Aquinas. I think that is his real name. Um, and Kevin from the Ark Ministry, who are debating over the subject matter of evolution. They touch on a lot of other, similar or related topic matters, like the Big Bang Theory or something like that. But it's mostly about evolution, or at least it's supposed to be. The conversation kind of went all over the place at one point, but in any case, Aaron has. We saw in the last video, Aaron redefines terms. He seems to not really fully understand where the actual issue lies, because he thinks that it just simply, the changes, small minor changes, eventually leads to the, taking it one step at a time, eventually leads to the huge changes that are claimed by evolutionists, but it doesn't. The issue is really over what kind of change is being claimed, and that's what you lack evidence for, is the kind of change you're claiming. And so, in reference to that, there's absolutely no evidence at all of Darwinian evolution, because that would require more information to be added to the genome. He seemed to skate over this because he seems to think that that the information argument is a weak argument, and therefore he just kind of blatantly dismisses it. And Kevin kind of just went with his dismissal and just kept moving on in the subject matter. But this was really, really, really the main focus. This is the main issue. This is what their debate should have been focused a little bit more on. Changing of one kind to another will require new information to be added to the genome. This material is used by permission. I actually reached out to Aaron Aquinas and got his personal permission for it. So we actually I have his permission to do this. And so, moving forward, I just want to make sure that I spell out that particular detail, that this material is being used by permission. But without further ado, let's dive in.
Now, the difficult part in terms of empirical evidence is this requires us to go further back in time, and the evidence starts to become more foggy and foggy. So I do think, and I'll probably agree with your sentiment here, there is some extrapolation of the evidence. Evolution kind of has to do this.
Extrapolating with the evidence. Extrapolating with the evidence. There is no actual evidence for evolution. None. What they're calling evidence for evolution is evidence for variations within a kind, which they think leads to these major classifications. But that's not evolution, because there's no additional information that's added. Actually, information is lost. When properly understood, as we pointed out in the last video, natural selection and mutations reduce the genetic information. They don't increase it. So it's not evolution. It's the very opposite of evolution. Let's move forward.
Evolution is not a complete theory. I think eventually they'll discover some new explanatory biomechanism that explains, say, Cambrian better. But over enough time, when you start with a single cell, well, you actually start with RNA that develops into complex enough structures to produce DNA that develops into complex enough structures that include multiple cells that reproduce, and so that's kind of how they see the chain. Now the evidence won't.
He says they started out with RNA. This is a hypothesis that it has become very popular among many atheists. There are still, evolutionists that would reject this view, but it has become kind of popular among a lot of evolutionists. And it's called the RNA world hypothesis, also known as the RNA first hypothesis. It's the same thing. There's two different names for the same thing. And essentially, this has lots of problems in it. These problems have been noted both by young Earth creationists and old Earth creationists. Old Earth creationists such as over here, I got a book by Dr. Stephen. Looks like C. Mayer, Dr. Stephen C. Mayer, signature in the Cell. He's an old Earth creationist, and he noted problems with the RNA first hypothesis. Also, you have other people that note problems with the RNA first hypothesis, even the young Earth creationists. I've got an article here. Okay, here's the article. It says, even if, and this is on Answers in Genesis website, even if, and that's a big if, you can get all the right ingredients for RNA together in the same pond at the same time under the right environmental conditions and concentrations to chemically form RNA, you don't have life. Life requires information. And this is proposed formation of random collection of nuclear-based strings isn't information any more than a random string of letters is. It doesn't mean anything unless there is a pre-existing code, a language, to give the sequence meaning. Remember, they're not even sure how these could form RNA yet, much less DNA, chromosomes, or cells that life requires. Each of these being huge, insurmountable step, and information only comes from other information or an information giver, a mind. And that's also what Werner Gitt also says, that information can only come from an intelligent source. And that's what we've always observed, by the way. This article was written by Avery Foley on Answers in Genesis, and did Meteorites and Worm Ponds Make Life is the name of it. And this problems wrong with RNA is not just noted by young Earth creationists. This problem is also noted by old Earth creationists as well, and even some evolutionists as well. For example, the problems of getting the right ingredients together is hugely, as that article says, insurmountable. You know, Dr. Stephen Mayer said that there's a mountain of problems wrong with this. I think he said that in an interview with Lee Strobel in The Case for a Creator. But there's a mountain of problems wrong with the RNA hypothesis, including trying to get the right ingredients together because they're extremely fragile to begin with. But even if you could get it under the right environmental conditions, you couldn't do it in the open because oxygen destroys amino acids, and so you couldn't be able to form RNA out in the open anyhow. And so they try to form it in the oceans, and then they wind up with problems there too. And so it winds up with all kinds of issues. But the main issue that all the sources agree, I actually found an article that lists 19 different problems wrong with the RNA verse hypothesis. So we're talking about a hypothesis that's loaded down with problems. I think Stephen Mayer mentions maybe 5 of them, maybe 5 or so. But there's several problems wrong with it, and there were big problems too. And just getting the ingredients together is huge. But there is a fundamental problem, and all the sources also agree on this. The fundamental problem is information. It's still not information. You don't have information inside the cell. Even if you have RNA. And like that one article says, stringing something together randomly doesn't produce information because information is language. And so you can't string a bunch of letters together and expect it to spell out a name. Like if you saw some random letters, let's say you saw N and I, and you saw a, you saw an R and a B, would you automatically assume no? It's just a random bunch of letters. But what if those letters were rearranged to spell Brian? Well, that's a message. That's information. And it's not enough just to have a random, meaningless stream of letters. You have to have it have meaning to it. It has to have a language in order to be information. And so this is a fundamental problem with the RNA first hypothesis. So although he is correct that is what they believe, a lot of them believe, they're just wrong on it. I mean, there's just all kinds of problems associated with it.
The further back you go, the less clear of an example I can give. Like monarch butterflies and bonobos and chimpanzees are a lot clearer to see because they're more recent. But if you're looking over billions of years, it's going to get a lot foggier.
Yeah, so foggier that there's no evidence for it. That's how foggy it gets. But this seems like almost a cop-out. Like the longer we go, that's why we don't see no evidence of it, because it's a long time ago. That's the reason, because it's a far away. But the reality is that we don't see evidence of it because it's not true. It didn't happen. That's why we don't see evidence of it. The burden of proof is on them to provide evidence. They can't provide speculation and then call it evidence. It doesn't work that way. It's speculation. It's a guess on it. But yeah.
And what I think could be helpful for a creationist, not necessarily a young earth creationist, but just a person that believes in an intelligent designer, is there's actually certain points you could use the evolutionary history as sort of evidence for it. And what's interesting about that, and even the Big Bang Theory, is when they first came out, it seemed to suggest, creationism doesn't have a place anymore. But the more we learn about it, the more it starts to suggest the creator again. So there's this sort of ebb and flow pendulum swing of like creator, no creator, like in history, right? In the Enlightenment, people didn't believe in a creator, but the more science they did, and now more science they do again. So it kind of swings back and forth. But the way I see it is the less we know about the natural world, the more we attribute to God. The slightly more we learn about the natural world, the less we attribute to God. But then even more we learn, the more we attribute to God again, because we start to see the intelligence behind it. That's the ebb and flow I've been seeing in the history.
All right. He says that he sees that you can. What he's trying to say is that he thinks that the things like the Big Bang Theory and evolution can be used to support the idea of a creator God. The problem, however, is that you're taking something with loaded down with bad arguments and trying to use that to support God, and it just makes us look even worse. That's not a good idea to use that with the existence of God, for start with. I'll try to use the best arguments I can whenever I'm supporting a position. I don't use the worst arguments I can just because they agree with me. I mean, it's easy to be attracted to an argument like that. Just be attracted to an argument that doesn't, that just kind of something that just agrees with you. So you accept the argument even though the argument is terrible. You don't do that. That's not a proper way to argue a position. And so I wouldn't argue from a weak argument. And that's a weak argument. Evolution is a weak argument. Sometimes people try to argue from a common ground perspective and that sort of thing. But the more we know about the natural world, we do see a creator in that. But not because evolution was not part of the natural world. It did not actually happen. It's not in Scripture. It's not recorded by Scripture. The Bible records a completely different history of the world from the one that's recorded by evolution. And so, yeah, it's not. It's not. It's not. It's not something that could be used for that purpose. And there's also other issues with doing that, especially when the people who created these views were not using them to create God. Like when the Big Bang Theory was first created, it was created by a Roman Catholic priest who believed in God, but he had a particular philosophy, Lemaitre. He had a particular philosophy to not include God in there. So he didn't factor God into it. And Charles Darwin completely lost his faith on that ship because he was influenced by people like Charles Lisle, who came up with the idea of the geologic column, and James Hutton, which we'll talk about later. I don't know if we're to get to him in this video or not, but he's the inventor of uniformitarianism. And yet, these guys influenced Charles Darwin, and so eventually, he deconverted, or if you want to call it that, and he believed in trying to come up with a naturalistic occurrence. In fact, all throughout his books, both of his books, he constantly referred to human beings as animals. He constantly referred to us as that. In the Bible, we are not animals. We're special. We're created in the image of God. And so each one of us is special to God because we're created in his image. We're image bearers. And so evolution tries to strip us of our uniqueness among the world, in terms of life in this world. And the Bible clearly indicates that we are image bearers of God. And so I would disagree with this idea of using evolution to support the existence of a creator, especially when the Bible that tells us that God exists tells us how God created the world, and evolution claims things that oppose the very scriptures themselves. So keep that in mind.
And an example of that is the Cambrian event. So evolution sees it in, hypothetically, as this perfectly stretched gradient where you have simple, more complex, more complex, more complex. But it's actually not how it happened. In that fossil
Because evolution didn't happen.
record, the way it happens is you have simple, 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 complex, out of nowhere. And then all those phyla that happened in the Cambrian event still exist today or are gone. There's no new phyla that evolved.
That's because it didn't evolve. That's the whole point. And this is actually evidence against evolution. So even if I were to work off the secular history, you've got Okay, we're not going to get too much into the geologic column. The geologic column technically doesn't exist on Earth. It exists in textbooks, but it doesn't really exist on Earth. What exists on Earth is actually strata layers. And these strata layers are different kind of strata layers, but they're located all over the world, okay, in different locations around the world. I believe Cambrian layer is located near Cambria, England, or something like that. And these layers are stacked on top of each other in the geologic column. At least they're placed on there in the framework, and so they're placed in a particular order, in a particular sequence. And Charles Darwin based his evolution theory of evolution on this sequence because, like I said, that's one of the people he was influenced by was Charles Lyell, who invented the geologic column. So this is the secular geologic history of the Earth. I disagree with this because I think all the layers were compacted with by a global flood, and there's actually loads and loads of evidence of this. We'll get into that when we get in the Genesis series, and when we get to the areas of the flood, we'll cover a lot of videos on the flood during that time. And it's going to be so cool because I'm going to have lots and lots of really cool videos during that time. I'm going to have cool videos throughout the Genesis series. So if you ain't subscribed to my channel, please subscribe, like the video. Don't forget to drop me a comment below. Don't forget to hit that notification bell. It'll be awesome to hear from you. And I will also to join this community of YouTubers. It is awesome what we're doing on this channel. I am pumped up about the Genesis series. I just can't wait. I really want to produce another video soon, and so I probably will. But I want to kind of try to get through this debate review as quickly as possible because I want to keep my focus on the Genesis series where I move ahead on that, because I've got a lot of interesting videos planned up. And so it'll be so cool to continue it and talk to some interesting people and do some cool interviews and things like that. And so we'll have some awesome stuff ahead. Eric Hoban's supposed to join me on my channel by the end of the month of January as well, and so that they'll have that cool discussions on that as well. But so please subscribe to my channel, hit that notification bell so you can be alerted of all future videos. I just wanted to let you know that. But moving ahead, there is no the whole that evidence from the strata layers. If you're looking at the geologic timescale according to secularists, I don't agree with that timescale, but assuming their timescale, you got all these lower levels that have these single cell organisms, and then you have what they call complex organisms. Now understand something, even a single cell organism like an amoeba is extremely complex in terms of its information system, as well as systems itself inside the cell are extremely complex. It's more complex than a Cray supercomputer. It's more complex than a NASA space shuttle. It's extremely complex information. The information in it, as well as the systems that operate within the cell, is extremely complex. And that's just a single cell organism. What typically they call a simple cell or a complex cell in biology is when you have either a single cell organism versus a multi-cell organism. They call single cell organisms simple cells, and they call multi-cell organisms complex organisms. And this is because the cell has to be harmonized with all the other cells in the organism, and so they call it complex organisms. And so you have all of these complex organisms suddenly appearing in the Cambrian layer, which actually contradicts evolutionary view. Actually, it's powerful evidence against evolution, not in favor of it. So I don't know why he throws that out there like that's okay. You can use evolution and creation, and he throws something out that contradicts evolution. That wouldn't work that way. But also another thing is jellyfish is in that. Interesting. Jellyfish. And jellyfish are soft-bodied creatures that would resist fossilization unless, of course, they were rapidly buried. So they wouldn't have been buried over millions of years. There should be no soft-bodied creatures in the fossil record at all. So that's evidence of a global flood. And of course, young Earth creationists see the both the fossil evidence and the geological evidence in light of a global flood, because it makes more sense of what we're observing. Why is the idea of evolution over millions, billions of years makes even less sense. But anyway, there is no evidence for evolution. There's no evolutionary development. There's none. That's why you see complex organisms, because evolution is flawed to begin with.
Since Cambrian. And that's pretty decent evidence that the odds of that happening by chance start to shrink. And
again, evidence against evolution. That's why they say even if evolution was possible, I don't even think it's possible, but even if it was possible, the odds of it happening is astronomical. And so it's not that the odds shrink and, it was really good then, but then shrink since then. The odds were always against the idea of evolution ever happening. I think what he's trying to argue is that because this is astronomically unlikely to have happened by chance, then maybe God did the evolution. I think that's what he's trying to get at. The problem, however, is that why would God, who's a perfect creator, use a random naturalistic chance system, which is that basically is advancing and mutating life and through natural processes, through mistakes, essentially. So you have constantly death. It's almost like evolution it's supposed to be the naturalistic version of trial and error, pretty much. So it's a kind of trial and error. But God doesn't make mistakes. And so how could God be so delimited that he ends up not being able to create in a way that could make perfect creations? Now, of course, in the young Earth view, we do see God making a perfect creation because he made everything good and he made it very good, he says. But in the evolutionary view, he doesn't make everything perfect. I mean, even if you try to advocate God in there, and then God just kind of uses a process of mistakes that are, is trial and error, pretty much, instead of making it right the first time. It wouldn't make any much sense. It would be a very hindered God. It would not be the God of Scripture. When Jesus did a miracle, he didn't do it over a course of time because he couldn't get the stuff right. Like, okay, this time around you'll grow your leg back. This time around, your blindness would be healed. Something like that. He wouldn't do that. When you turn water into wine, he didn't wait until the grapes fermented themselves. He didn't take the possibility that maybe somehow an accident would happen and somehow water that has no properties of fermentation would somehow ferment, or how you pronounce that. He didn't do that. And so why would we expect him to do it this time? So it doesn't make any sense. But the issue, of course, the primary issue is not what God could have done, but what God did do. And the evidence shows that God did not do it through evolutionary development.
I think that you could use that as a sort of evidence for intelligence. Some people are so incredulous to stay away from God that they've even hypothesized that aliens must have influenced the evolutionary history. Like that's
I actually have a friend that talks about that often.
That should be
the aliens.
That should be proof how incredulous people can be to avoid God.
Just referring to primates. Many evolutionists, of course, also believe the evolution from lesser, a primate, right? That eventually became human. And that's a question I often have also is, why is there no intermediate between a direct primate and human? There's no almost humans. Just like example, Lucy. Evolutionists tried to make that look like a missing link where they put the fake hairy human feet on her and the whites of the eyes, to look more human. But they didn't even find any foot bones, so it's fake. It's in museums all over the place. So there's really no evidence of it. You can make up evidence, but what I'm wondering is, where is this species of primate / human that's in between? Why did they not survive? What happened to them?
All right. He is asking about the intermediate species. Namely, he's asking about what's called the transitional species. Now, here, Aaron, I don't think Aaron fully understands all the issues. He seems to be not knowledgeable when it comes to the, and I mean, he admitted himself that he wasn't an expert of this subject matter. It's just kind of a side issue to him. He says it twice in this video concerning that. Um, I think the first time he said it, he said because he's not a scientist. The second time, he just kind of says that it's kind of a side issue for him. And he says it later on in the video. I don't know if I'll be getting to that or not. It was kind of later on. And some of the stuff that I watched recently of it. But essentially, Kevin is asking for the intermediate species. Now, most evolutionists, they may try to dodge the question, and they do. But they understand what we're asking for. They know what we're asking for when we're asking transitional. They may not want to answer it directly. They may not even want to answer it properly. And some don't even want to answer it honestly. Now, there's some that do answer it honestly and admit that there are very few fossils that are claimed to be transitional. And even the fossils that are claimed to be transitional are heavily disputed by evolutionists. And there's all sorts of questions about it, whether it's actually transitional or not. In fact, most evolutionists would say they're not transitional. That's the interesting thing of that, is that they will say that it is not a transitional fossil. But even if they were and they're not, it would be, the need would be millions upon millions of transitionals. So it's not just a few animals that are missing. It's not just one or two species here and there. They're not missing. They're missing. Rather, instead, it is the fact that you have an entire chain of missing transitionals, because you got this species over here, and this species over here, and this kind over here, this kind over here. They're found, and you might find variations of those kinds. But what you don't do is find one kind slowly and gradually going into another kind. We don't see that in the fossil record. And so that's what's called transitional fossils. We lack knowledge of transitional fossils. There is no transitional fossils in the fossil record. So that would be interesting to know. Okay, he wants to know, okay, what happened to all this transitional? Why? I mean, it's obviously missing from the fossil evidence, in spite of the fact that we've got millions of fossils all over the world that have been found. And yet these missing transitionals are missing from the fossil record. All we ever find is whole animals. And he asked specifically about the human evolution. You could ask that in general about transitionals, but he's asking specifically about alleged human evolution, about between ape and man, and an ape-like ancestor and man supposed to have a common ancestor. So you would think that you got two branches that just gradually go from this ape man all the way to being an ape or a human, just kind of gradually move off along those lines. And we don't see that. It's not in the fossil record at all. Evolutionists are honest with it and knowledgeable about the subject matter. Like maybe Stephen Jay Gould or something like that would actually admit that the lack of fossil evidence for transitionals. Even Charles Darwin in his books actually admitted that the fossil evidence didn't support his view. And also talked about these missing transitionals as well. And so we were asking the same question: what about those missing transitionals? Now, he seems to answer in a way that doesn't actually answer the question at all. Instead, he points to specific fossil finds of humans that are fully human. He'll even talk about Neanderthals and then admit that they're human or some form of human. Okay, that doesn't answer the question of missing transitionals. So let's hear him out and see what he says.
So I do have an answer to this, and I'll be answering purely from science from here. But
I want to interrupt, but what do you think about dinosaurs? What were the dinosaurs?
Well, I'll make it. I can give you specifics, but in case you have more questions like this, I pretty much accept whatever science tells me.
Okay.
Because I can identify.
He says he accepts whatever science tells him, and I talked about this in the last video. We need to be critical thinkers and be able to think through it. Evolutionists do a very poor job of thinking through evidence and problem solve with. I mean, they don't really critically think much. You know, a lot of evolutionists will say, "Oh, well, it must be millions of years old because this person says it is." That doesn't mean it's millions of years old. These things don't come with name tags on them. They don't come with dates stamped on them. You know, some people think that when a scientist says, "Oh, well, they're 45 million years old," they take the dinosaur fossil, they scanned it with their tricorder, they beamed it up to the Enterprise, and now they know it's 45 million years old. And there's actually a simpler explanation. They guessed. That's it in a nutshell. They guessed. But in any given case, but they based it on their evolutionary presuppositions, is what it comes down to, and they interpret the evidence accordingly. So, yeah, I wouldn't just. And if he says he based it on what scientists say, scientists don't all agree. In fact, they rarely agree on everything. There's always scientists that disagree. He may be talking about the majority of scientists, so it's being appealed to a majority, but scientists don't all agree. There's actually young Earth creation scientists as well with a PhD that we rejected, including older Earth creation scientists that reject evolution. I talked about one right here, Stephen C. Mayer. He's actually an older Earth creationist, but he disagrees with evolution. And so you got old Earth creation scientists as well as young Earth creation scientists who disagree with evolution. So if he just accepts anything that scientists says, would he accept what these scientists are saying? Probably not. So that's kind of inconsistent too. You have to be able to be a critical thinker. This is one of the things that I often promote because I consider myself a critical thinker. I think through problems. I think through issues. I don't just believe something just because someone tells me it's true. That's called being gullible. I don't want to be gullible. And so I actually take the time to check people out, even people that I think agree with their position. Even if they say something that agrees with my way of thinking, I still question that. I challenge my way of thinking even, and making sure that what I am saying is on par with good enough justification. And simply, my favorite scientist, you know, so and so says this, that makes it true. That's not being a critical thinker. That's being gullible.
When science stops being science.
Right.
So, when science, like when evolution says it was unguided, therefore there's no God, that's not science. Mm-hmm. But when they say natural selection by random mutation, yeah, that's empiricism. Like that, we can test that.
Yeah, but we can't test it in the past. You could test it in the present, as far as natural selection and mutation, but you can't test it in the past because the past is gone. Maybe you can infer it back to the past, maybe, but you're always going to face assumptions. Maybe the assumption is going to be reasonable, and then others unreasonable. But either way, you're going to have to face assumptions no matter what.
So I'll accept that. But so when you ask me what I believe about the dinosaurs, yeah, I'll accept what science tells us. And
does science mention something about they evolved into birds, our common birds?
Those are called the avian dinosaur. There's different types of dinosaurs. So the surviving ancestors of the dinosaurs, or I guess you could say the surviving cousins of the dinosaurs, are the avian species. In fact, there's a lot of in genetic we can manipulate the genetics.
All right. Before we get into the chicken, he says that that birds are evolved from dinosaurs. He says that they're called the avian dinosaurs. I don't know why he said this. I actually don't know why he says this, because all of the research that I did on the subject matter yields that evolutionists don't believe that they evolved from the avian dinosaurs. What they believe they evolved from were meat-eating dinosaurs, not avian. Avian means bird-like. So if he says avian dinosaurs, he's probably likely referring to things like pterodactyls, pterodons, the pterosaurs, that sort of thing. And he's probably likely referring to them. Except the fact is, okay, one, they're actually not considered dinosaurs. I know we sometimes call them dinosaurs. It's easy to claim that they're dinosaurs, but what we're actually referring to as dinosaurs when we say dinosaurs, at least in the strict sense of the word, is we're actually referring to land animals. The animals that walked upright on land. Or not necessarily upright. They can walk on all fours like a brachiosaurus or something, but we mean land animals. So a plesiosaurus, in the water, a plesiosaurus, I think it's called, in the water is a sea creature. It's not a dinosaur. Pterodons, also not dinosaurs. You could maybe call them flying reptiles, possibly. But pterodons aren't dinosaurs, technically, because they're not land animals. We technically call a dinosaur a land animal dinosaur. But none of, even though it would kind of make sense, people, if you believe in evolution, it would probably make more sense to believe that a pterodon evolved into a bird because it already has wings, right? But that's not what evolutionists claim. Evolutionists claim that the meat-eating dinosaurs evolved, or some of the meat-eating dinosaurs evolved into birds. It's what they claim. So that's why I'm not exactly sure. I couldn't find anything on anyone saying that the avian dinosaurs, I assume he means pterodons and pterodactyls and those kinds of things, the pterosaurs, that he was claiming that they evolved into birds. And at least I assume that's what he's talking about, because that's the only thing I could think of that he would be referring to. But that's just not the case. I mean, at least not. I mean, I don't agree with any of them evolving into birds. I don't think birds are related to dinosaurs at all. But according to evolutionists, they think that the dinosaur evolved into birds, but that's false. One of the things that they try to claim as far as proof of this is a fossil find called Archaeopteryx, which is a dinosaur that was found, or claimed that it's a bird that was found that they thought was a transitional between dinosaurs and birds, because no head feathers were found in the fossils, so they imagine his head being, skelly, like a lizard's or something. But it turns out that when they studied it, they've discovered that like in case of modern species and stuff that got fossilized, often the little feathers on the head would fall off prior to fossilization. And so they would be fossilized without the feathers on the head. So a lot of modern drawings now of Archaeopteryx has it with feathers on its head. So now evolutionists are saying, oh, it's a full bird. I mean, it looks just like a modern bird, except it does have teeth. And so some people try to think, oh, well, it has teeth. So then that means that it's related to dinosaurs. No, the fact that it has teeth, and we're going to talk about this in a second because he's just about to bring it up, chicken and teeth. But the fact that it has teeth doesn't mean it's related. It just means birds had teeth at one point. But in any given case, the teeth on a meat-eating dinosaur is serrated, like a steak knife is serrated. And so, but the teeth on a bird's, or the teeth on Archaeopteryx, is actually kind of blunted a little bit. It's kind of curved, it's smooth, but it's not serrated like the meat eater's teeth. So it looks different. So all this means is that birds at one point had teeth. Somehow that gene got dormant. We'll talk more about that in a minute. Um, and well, before I get too far into that, I'm gonna let him finish his thought.
Of a chicken to grow its teeth back. You can check that out online. It's ridiculous. In the tails.
That's see when.
All right. He says, okay, he talks about the teeth. He says, oh, we can manipulate the mutation. You know, we can manipulate genetics of a chicken to get them to grow its teeth back. Okay, what mutations can do is they can turn off and on certain genes. That's one of the things that they can do. That certain genes, if a gene was turned off, okay, in genetics, they have something called gene regulation. This occurs naturally. We end up having certain genes inside of us. Some genes are active, other genes are dormant. This is, again, just like genetics 101. You know, I actually learned this in high school, you know, in biology class concerning genetics and that sort of thing. So this is very basic genetics. It's called gene regulation. It regulates the genes inside our bodies. We only can use or apply certain genes in our bodies and that are actually considered active while other genes are dormant. But mutations can also cause genes to go dormant and can reactivate them as well. And this is not adding new information. The information to create the gene is already there. It's just dormant. Like, you know, I always have the information for brown hair in me. Even though, you know, I had brown hair when I was younger, now I have black hair. It doesn't mean the gene to create brown hair goes out of me. My mom had brown hair. I mean, at one point, you know, when she was, you know, in my life, when she was a little younger than before she died. But she had brown hair. And she had brown hair most of my life. And I and my dad had black hair. And I have genes from both my mom and my dad, biological dad. And when I was little, I actually had brown hair. But eventually my hair shaded darker and darker and darker until it finally turned black. And so now I have black hair. And I've had that ever since. But doesn't mean the gene to create brown hair went away. It's still inside me. It's just dormant. It's no longer active. Birds have probably used to have teeth. If we understand, you know, Archaeopteryx, birds probably used to have teeth, and now the gene to create teeth was turned off in that sense. And they call it turning on or off. You know, when they talk about gene regulation, it's just like flipping a switch. You know, 1 minute you have light, next minute you don't. But it doesn't mean that the gene isn't present. It's still there. It's just not active. So it doesn't show any kind of manifestation of its existence inside of you. But it is there. And so you can manipulate a chicken's genetics so that would happen, where teeth will come out. This would not necessarily be, this would not mean as the same as adding information, and it wouldn't mean that they're related to dinosaurs either. See, most birds today don't have teeth, so they're assuming that, okay, well, if it used to have teeth, then those teeth must be related to dinosaurs, or no, because not all dinosaurs had teeth, I don't think. But in any given case, I'm thinking of some of the smaller ones might have, but I don't know. But anyway, the teeth of a mediator was serrated like a steak knife, which is very different from the teeth that we see on our Archaeopteryx. So it's not the same thing. They have teeth. They probably had teeth at one time. And so he sees this as sign evidence of evolution. It's not evolution. Even if they lost the gene completely, that would be the opposite of evolution, right? It'd be the reverse of it. So it wouldn't be evolution. They're about to get into some arguments on common design. Let's hear them out.
When that's brought up, I see that as common design. And similar DNA that's in, you know, compared like us, you know, 98% same DNA as in a monkey. Well, that's because I look at it. You may look at it as common ancestor, or I look at it as common design.
Honestly, I actually think those are the same thing. I think evolution is a form of common design. Now, I'm not saying you have to believe this, but as far as evolution could be, in theory, compatible with like a creator, not looking at the text yet, just the science.
Right.
Obviously, God, if he wanted to, if he's all powerful, he could have created a world in which he set up the circumstances in advance so perfectly that natural processes would evolve into humans.
All right. Okay, first of all, that last part, no, because then that would work. I mean, he could always use natural processes, of course. I'm not saying he can't, but the natural process that claimed by evolution is through mistakes and death, things that God doesn't do, and it's basically already hindering God that would have to work through chance and randomness and that sort of thing. Is likely not God. He said some other stuff too. He said he thinks that common design and common ancestry is the same thing. It's not the same thing. He's probably confusing the argument that's made by young Earth creationists on this. He's assuming because he believes in both of them that they're the same thing. Even if both of them were true, that wouldn't make them the same thing. And one of them is not true, and that is common ancestry. That's what we lack evidence for. But they're not the same thing. Okay, they're two different things. And so he's treating this like it's an either or thing, like either you this or you believe this. And he says, well, I believe both of those, so I believe they're the same thing. No, that's not the argument. The argument is simply this. Okay, you got two different perspectives that believe that expect certain things to emulate from that perspective. Okay, this is called, or at least what I'm about to discuss with you, is called the null hypothesis. It's not really a hypothesis. It's more of a statistical a way of evaluating or analyzing something. If you got two different models that predict the same thing and expect the same thing, you can't use their expectations necessarily against each other because both have that implication. Okay, that's the object of it. And of course, evolutionists do use that. They say, "Oh, look at the similarities in genetics." Well, at the same time, young Earth creationists look at that and say, "Look at the evidence of common design. We know that God used the same materials to make life, so we'd expect some similarity, that sort of thing. Apes have fingers, all 5 fingers, like we do. He has opposable thumb, I think. But either way, apes can have a hand. They can use their hand. And they can also use their feet like hand. We can't, but they can. There's obviously major differences that shouldn't be skated over. But there's also differences in genetics. Some people, he talked about 98% similarity. That's actually changed over time. Some would suggest 96. I think that the number now may be in the late 80s. I think it's gone down significantly the more we learn. We haven't even mapped all of human genome, but what we have learned from the human genome is significant. Because so there's a lot of significant changes, and there's a lot of stuff that's in our DNA and genetics that is actually being omitted by evolutionists as well. They're omitting a lot of stuff. And so there's all kinds of stuff. Once you start factoring that stuff in, the numbers actually go down even more significantly than they already have. In addition to that, you can't really change the genome within like a 3%, I think is what they give, 3% difference. Because as soon as you change it too significantly, it would result in the death of the organism. So you can't have that. And so, yeah, I when it comes to this, essentially, I think that it probably has a more likelihood of common designer than common ancestry. When you look at it, God makes everything out of the same thing. Like God made the whole universe out of atoms. In fact, atoms are called the building blocks of the universe. My son gave me a joke one day. He said, why don't we trust Adam? Why should you trust an atom? And he said, because they make up everything. which is true. They do. They make up everything. But it's not because they're being dishonest. It's because they're what God used as the building blocks of the universe. And all matter is made out of molecules. Yeah, all matter is made out of molecules. Um, Even gases, which is a type of matter, which is a which is one of the three stages of matter, and it's made out of molecules. All life has cells, cell boundaries, DNA, genetics, chromosomes, etc. All flesh life, such as there are living creatures, such as human, animals, are carbon based. So, I mean, these kinds of things indicates that God took common materials to make everything. And you would expect that really when you see vehicles and things like that. So it's much more evidence of common design than common ancestry. But if one sees them as the same thing, that's not really the question not really the objection that Cameron was making. Cameron was making the objection that, okay, from a perception base, you see it this way, but I'm seeing it this way because we expect two different expectations from it. All right, that's basically what he's saying, essentially. In statistics, we typically call this the null hypothesis, and this would rule out trying to use the expectation against the other. But it is true that that the that 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 it'd be more likely to represent the young Earth creationist view much more, that it represents a common designer more than it does that of than it does with common ancestry. But you can test this kind of because you can move outside of genetics, right? With common ancestry, you can only isolate it specifically to genetics. With common designer, you can actually move outside of genetics, such as, like I said, the whole universe is made out of atoms, all matter is made out of molecules, that sort of thing. And you could just kind of move and flow right into genetics as a result. Where you can't do this with common ancestry because you can only move inside genetics. But there's no evidence at all common ancestry, so that that also weighs against it. But anyway, let's continue.
Now, when God said it was good every time He made a creation, and we say that evolution is basically survival of the fittest, right? So there are many things had to die and suffer for a life form to advance into a more advanced type of life. So why would God say that was good if He created everything to evolve and the lesser had to die out?
So I could think of a few. I'm not going to say demonstrably what the sort of exegesis answer is, but philosophically, I could think of a few answers. Like, why would it be good for, say, predation to exist before man, like the dinosaurs or something like that? But what if it was good because those events exactly happened because it led rise to humanity, which is actually the science belief. The science belief is that if the dinosaurs weren't extinct from the Yucatan asteroid, humanity and mammals never would have dominated the planet. So it had to start with mammals, and then mammals evolved into apes, which evolved into humans. That never would have happened if dinosaurs stuck around, because mammals couldn't get large enough because of the dinosaurs. They were always small, like shrew-like. I think the biggest mammal in the Cretaceous was like the size of a raccoon. So you didn't have large mammals.
When you say dinosaur, it doesn't mean it's 20 tons, but I also believe that this is a whole other discussion.
All right, before we get into that, what about dinosaurs? He says that dinosaurs would have lived alongside man. If he said, okay, he said several things, but let's deal with the first one. He said predation does not necessarily have to be a bad thing. He's talking about, predatorial type of situation where animals are eating other animals. But this is, and he says this is a philosophical answer, but that's probably not so much. But it would be, either way, it would be false. Here's the thing. There's no reason to believe. I mean, that's you can even perceive this argument's a bit circular. Actually, he's assuming his position in the process. But the reality is that you cannot have death and suffering prior to sin coming into the world. That includes predation. He says predation could be a good thing, but it's not. It's never perceived as a good thing. Um, he says that if humans were if this happened, then humans could not possibly be the dominant species on the planet. That's false. For one thing, like Kevin said, they're not 20 tons. Not all dinosaurs were 20 tons. No, actually, most dinosaurs weren't. This is what blows people away a lot of times on dinosaurs. The average dinosaur was no bigger than a big buffalo. That's average. You know, that's average size dinosaur. And then you got a lot of them that were smaller than that. And of course, not even the big ones started out small. A dinosaur egg was no bigger than a football. That surprised a lot of people. It's no bigger than a football. So even the big ones started out young. They started out small. They all did. And so most dinosaurs, even in the evolutionary view, most dinosaurs were most dinosaurs were actually, and even in the evolutionary view, most dinosaurs were plant eaters. Only some of them were meat eaters. I think a lot of people have what I like to call a Hollywood mentality when it comes to dinosaurs. They're so used to seeing dinosaurs on the silver screen that they think that all dinosaurs were like Godzilla type creatures and that they ate everything in sight. And that's just not the case. Most of the dinosaurs, even in the evolutionary view, was plant eaters, and most of them, the vast majority of them, weren't that huge. And so you got that kind of situation. You got some of them being scavengers, some of them being most of them being plant eaters, and only some of the dinosaurs being meat eaters. Only very few of them were huge. So you don't have dinosaurs that just walking around massive, bloodthirsty all the time and stuff like that. And of course, there's also issues involving with assuming that all the dinosaurs ate meat because they're of the shape of their teeth, because they're sharp teeth or something. But we have animals today that have sharp teeth that eat plants. Fruit bat, for example. Also. You got most bears, they're omnivorous today. They still eat plants. I mean, some of them still eat animals because of sin and stuff like that. But most of them still will eat plants. Some of them will only eat plants. Like, for example, a koala bear is 100% vegetarian. Eats koala leaves predominantly, or sometimes they'll eat leaves from foreign trees. It's in Australia, but other trees besides the ukulele leaves. But most time it eats ukulele leaves, and also they eat berries and they eat nuts. And the sharp claws on their fingers that looks a lot like Tyrannosaurus Rex claws. They actually use those to peel back the nuts. So I'm not saying that after sin was committed that some of these dinosaurs didn't turn to meat. In fact, I'm almost sure that they did. But what I am saying is the fact that they have sharp teeth doesn't mean that their exclusive diet was always meat. And so also initially at the beginning, before sin came into the world, when dinosaurs were first created, along with the other animals, other land animals, and dinosaurs, like all the creatures on Earth, including humans, ate vegetarian. They didn't eat meat. And so there is no reason not to expect that human beings would have been able to thrive and ultimately become the dominant species on the planet. There's no reason to think that, other than just because you just really don't want to believe what scripture says or something like that. In any case, dinosaurs were the most, or but there's no reason to think that. But at any rate, that would not be a good thing. Predation, any kind of suffering, any kind of thing like that would not be a good thing. The Bible says, like he said 7 times, he says it was good. That God's creation was good. He made it good. He made it perfect. The last time he says he made it very good. And so to really emphasize the word good there. And God always determines good by his standards, not ours. So he's not basing it on our standard of goodness, which is going to be much more or less than perfect, right? But God's standard of goodness is always based on himself. He uses himself as that standard. He says, be ye holy, for I am holy. He said, be you holy, for I am holy. And so he himself is that standard. He says that because I could swear by no greater, I swear by myself. There's none that's greater than God. The Bible says there's none that's greater than God. No, not one. And so nobody is greater than God, and nobody would be used as a standard of God. So God's standard of goodness is nothing less than perfection. So we would not expect things like this. So trying to judge goodness by Aaron's own standard or someone else's standard is not the same as what God means by the word. So there can be nothing less than perfection and what God is talking about. Now I'm going to go ahead and end the video here. We're going to cue the conclusion, and then I'm going to end the video here because I got other things to do. It's getting kind of late, and we'll have to deal with more of these arguments a little bit later. So let's cue the closing. All right. That was interesting. Again, I didn't, I don't know how much more of this video or these videos I'm gonna make of this particular debate review, or this particular debate. Do a review of this particular debate. Because I don't expect anything really good to come in, and the arguments are getting worse and worse and worse and worse. So I'm not expecting more from Aaron at this point, but there are some things that he does say a little bit later that I did get into that I do want to respond to. So I'm going to continue with the series, but I didn't want to do too long this time around. Hopefully I hadn't. And be back with you again, hopefully part 3 of this series soon. And I'll continue the Genesis series as well. That's the one I really want to focus on after I get some stuff straightened out with some of my sources there. And in any given case, I'm glad you joined me. Don't forget to like the video. Don't forget to subscribe to my channel. Don't forget to hit the notification bell to be notified of all future videos. I got a lot of stuff in store for you. This is just me basically going over this debate and responding to some of the arguments that are made, because I think he confuses terminology, he conflates terminology, he redefined things. I mean, it's all kinds of weird stuff that's happening in this debate. It's like a collage of just blah. I don't mean that to be disrespectful to Aaron. I'm sure Aaron admits twice in the video that he's not an expert in this subject matter, and that this is not even his area of speciality. It's just kind of like a side issue. He mentioned that on the second time around. He mentions that as this just kind of a side thing for him. So he lacks a lot of knowledge in this area, and I kind of expect that. But his arguments are really, really bad, and he clearly didn't know what the issues were. And there's a lot more than that, that I've already watched that where he does not seem to understand terms. He doesn't understand issues. For example, Kevin would bring up the tissue that was found in dinosaur fossils. Now, just to be fair, this video was made a couple years back, so maybe he knows more now than he did then. But there's all kinds of terrible arguments in it. And it really shows up. His lack of knowledge in this area shows up in the arguments and responses a lot. Maybe he just didn't think somebody was going to evaluate his arguments. Of course, this is the internet. Everybody evaluates your arguments. It's just the way it goes. But in any given case, again, thank you for joining on here. Join me next time, maybe next week, I don't know, whenever I'm producing a video. And remember, always stay in the know.